Imagine this. It's the late 1990s. The world is buzzing with dot-com optimism, and Wall Street is throwing money at anything that moves. In the middle of all that stands Enron, the darling of the energy sector, a supposedly cutting-edge company riding the wave of deregulation and innovation. Every newspaper headline calls them the smartest guys in the room, the future of American business. But what nobody knows yet is that behind that golden glow lies a house of cards built on lies, arrogance, and creative accounting. You might ask, how did a company selling gas and electricity turn into an empire worth tens of billions of dollars on paper? Well, it all starts with a man named Kenneth Lay, the son of a poor Baptist minister who believed in the power of free markets like a true prophet. Lay had a dream: to turn the dull, heavily regulated business of energy into something sexy, dynamic, tradable, like stocks. He built Enron in 1985 after merging two companies and pushing the big idea that energy could be bought and sold like any other financial instrument. Sounds clever, doesn't it? It was. But it was also dangerous. You see, the United States had just begun deregulating its energy markets. That means fewer government rules limiting prices and competition, and more room for companies to invent or manipulate the system. For someone like Lay, that was like opening a candy store without supervision. He hired Jeff Skilling, a former McKinsey consultant with the confidence of a rock star and the charm of a shark. Skilling introduced a financial trick called mark-to-market accounting, which let Enron count expected future profits as actual current income. Translation? They could say they made money today from deals that wouldn't pay off for 10 or 15 years, if ever. Think about that for a second. Imagine you signed a contract to mow lawns for the next 10 summers, and you told your friends you were already a millionaire because of it. Sounds absurd, right? Yet Wall Street bought it. Analysts couldn't get enough of Enron because every quarter the numbers went up like magic. Profits surged, stock prices soared, executives looked like geniuses, and investors jumped in without questioning how those profits were actually made. By 1999, Enron was valued higher than traditional giants like IBM or General Electric. They made it look easy. Too easy, if you were paying attention. But that's the thing. Few people did. Enron's operations were deliberately complex. Thousands of subsidiaries, complicated contracts, and deals that no one outside the company could fully understand. And that opacity became their greatest weapon. They presented themselves as innovators at the frontier of energy trading, broadband, even weather futures. You name it, they said they could make a market out of it. At conferences, Enron was celebrated as the model for the future, the perfect blend of capitalism and technology. The message was clear. If you didn't understand what they did, that was your problem, not theirs. Inside Enron's glass towers in Houston, the atmosphere was something between a cult and a casino. People worked insane hours, chasing bonuses and recognition. The office was buzzing with ambition and adrenaline. Everyone wanted to be in the top ranks. If you weren't delivering record profits, you were out. Literally, the culture was built on what Skilling called rank and yank, a brutal system where employees were constantly ranked and the lowest scorers were fired every year. It created an environment where fear and greed danced together in perfect rhythm. No one stopped to ask whether those profits were real. They just needed to beat the next quarter's expectations. Want to know how intense it got? Imagine this. People would cheer in the trading room when energy prices spiked because it meant Enron's traders were making big money, even if that meant customers in California were sinking under massive bills. Ethics didn't matter. What mattered was keeping the image of endless growth alive. Every executive was obsessed with stock price because most of their wealth was tied to it. And as long as the price kept climbing, everyone felt rich. This image spread like wildfire into the media. Business magazines crowned Enron as America's most innovative company 6 years in a row. Politicians praised it as proof that deregulation worked. Even universities held Enron up as a case study of success. The public saw a corporation leading the energy revolution, and employees felt lucky to be part of it. Some even invested their life savings into company shares, convinced they were betting on the future. Nobody imagined that future would collapse in flames so soon. At its core, Enron thrived on illusions. Their financial reports looked spectacular, but they were smoke and mirrors, carefully crafted to make failure look like success. When a project didn't perform, they simply pushed the debt into one of their many special purpose entities, basically shell companies created to hide losses from the official books. These off-the-books vehicles were run by their own executives, like Andy Fastow, Enron's chief financial officer. He managed to appear like a financial wizard while shuffling debt around so fast you could barely track it. The trick was simple. The main company looked clean while the dirt was hidden in the shadows. If you're wondering how no one noticed, the answer is trust and greed. Investors trusted Enron because the numbers looked pretty. Analysts kept recommending the stock because their firms were making money from Enron's deals. And auditors looked the other way because the fees were too good to turn down. Everyone was happy to believe the dream. Remember, this was the roaring 1990s. Tech companies with no profits were hitting billion-dollar valuations daily. In that era, Enron fit the narrative perfectly. High tech meets high finance. Nobody wanted to be the party pooper who said the emperor had no clothes. And yet, there were warning signs. Some analysts asked for clearer financial statements and were met with hostility. One even got mocked by Skilling during a conference call, who called him a rude name for daring to question the numbers. That single moment should have been a red flag. But the market laughed it off because, hey, Enron was making money, or at least pretending to. When perception becomes more valuable than reality, the truth has already lost. Behind the scenes, employees began noticing things didn't add up. Some projects supposedly bringing massive profits were strangely empty. No clients, no cash flow, just paperwork and projections. Departments like Enron Broadband promised revolutionary changes to internet infrastructure, yet produced nothing but PowerPoint slides and hype. You probably know that kind of corporate promise. All talk, no product. The people who tried to raise concerns were often ignored or pushed aside. In a place where ambition ruled, doubt was seen as betrayal. The higher Enron climbed, the greater the pressure to keep the illusion alive. Executives couldn't afford a single quarter of bad news. If real profits didn't appear, no problem. They just made them up. The accounting system turned imagination into currency. And every successful lie demanded a bigger one next time. Think of it like juggling knives. At first, it looks cool. Then, one slip, and the whole act becomes deadly. Meanwhile, Kenneth Lay played the role of the benevolent leader, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with politicians, and donating to campaigns. He was close to the corridors of power in Washington, especially during the administration that loved deregulation talk. Enron's lobbying machine made sure the rules always favored them. They called it innovation. Critics might call it manipulation. But as long as the market stayed fooled, Lay and his team looked unstoppable. By the end of 2000, Enron was the 7th largest company in the United States. Its stock price, which had started in single digits, had soared to over $90 per share. On paper, it was a fairy tale of capitalism. An energy company reinventing finance, technology, and global trade. But beneath that surface, debts were piling up. Assets were imaginary, and the tower was tilting. The same system that inflated their success also guaranteed their downfall. Because when your business model is built on pretending, sooner or later, reality catches up. And that's exactly what was about to happen. The illusion couldn't last forever. Within months, the brightest company in the world would implode spectacularly, leaving behind a trail of ruins, destroyed pensions, shattered trust, and the end of corporate innocence in America. You may think this story is just about a bunch of greedy executives, but trust me, it's much bigger than that. It's a lesson about systems, incentives, and what happens when ambition stops being a tool and becomes an addiction. Before we move to that collapse, take a moment to think about this. If a company like Enron could fool everyone, investors, analysts, regulators, even its own employees, then what does that say about how the markets value success? Maybe success isn't just about numbers, but about the story those numbers tell. And Enron told the best story money could buy until the truth broke through the curtain. That's where we're heading next. When the smiles faded and the lies started to show their cracks, because, as always, illusions are powerful, but not eternal. Let's get into the meat of it. You already know Enron was selling dreams disguised as profits, but how exactly did they pull it off? Because this wasn't just a couple of bad entries in a spreadsheet. This was a system, a playbook so elaborate and so convincing that even seasoned investors, regulators, and auditors didn't see through it until it was far too late. It all begins with a fancy accounting trick called mark-to-market. Sounds sophisticated, right? Basically, it allowed Enron to record potential future profits from deals the moment they signed them. So if Enron signed a 20-year energy contract, they'd estimate all the money they thought they might make over the next 2 decades. Write it down as if they already earned it, and call it revenue. In other words, they were cashing imaginary checks. The catch? If those projects later lost money, they never went back to correct it. The books always looked like a fairy tale. Let's make it concrete. Imagine you're selling lemonade. You make a deal today to supply lemonade for the next 5 years. Instead of waiting until you sell each glass, you grab your calculator and say, "Let's see, I'll make $10,000 by then," and you report it now. You haven't made that money, but everyone thinks your lemonade stand's booming. That, my friend, was Enron's business model, only with billions of dollars and thousands of contracts. They wrapped everything in the complex jargon of derivatives and energy swaps, so no one dared to ask too many questions. Jeff Skilling, the master architect, adored this method. He called it innovative accounting, but in reality, it was legalized illusion. Under his leadership, Enron transformed from a boring utility company into a Wall Street wonder. They weren't trading energy anymore. They were trading the idea of energy, turning megawatts into financial instruments. If you've ever seen a magician pull a rabbit from a hat, you'll understand the appeal. The audience doesn't see the trick, they just applaud the illusion. And that applause kept the stock price climbing. But here's the problem with illusions. They need fresh tricks to stay alive. Enron had to keep finding ways to hide the fact that its actual operations weren't producing cash. So they turned to what's called special purpose entities, or SPEs. Don't let the name fool you. An SPE is basically a side company, created to move debt off the main company's books. Think of it like sweeping trash under the rug before your guests arrive. On paper, Enron looked spotless. In reality, the dirt was piling up just out of sight. The genius, or villain, behind the SPEs was Andy Fastow, the chief financial officer. He built a maze of these shell entities, often managed by himself and funded by Enron's own stock. That's already a conflict of interest, but it gets worse. These entities would borrow money or buy assets from Enron, but instead of showing that as debt, Enron recorded it as profit. It was accounting alchemy, turning liabilities into income. And since Enron's shares kept rising, those fake profits looked even better. It was a self-feeding feedback loop of deceit. Picture this. Enron spins off a company, maybe called something random like LJM, and uses it to buy underperforming Enron assets. The sale makes it look like Enron's making money, but both entities are basically controlled by the same people. That's the financial equivalent of selling your left hand to your right hand and calling it profit. Yet investors believed it because the paperwork was complex, the tone was confident, and the stock market was in love with anything that promised easy returns. And here comes the really bizarre part. Some of these entities were named after Star Wars characters. Seriously. There was one called Jedi, another named Chuko. The idea was to make them sound harmless or even clever, masking what they actually were: black holes sucking in Enron's debt. Inside the company, people joked about it all the time, thinking they were too smart to get caught. That arrogance would later cost them everything. To keep the game going, Enron needed its stock price to stay high, because those special entities were secured with Enron shares. If the share price dropped, the entire structure would implode. So executives started manipulating every report, every press release, every earnings call to sustain faith in the company. Reality became something negotiable. Bad news was spun into good news, and numbers could always be adjusted. One executive even bragged that Enron could make its earnings anything they wanted, whenever they wanted. That kind of hubris is like juggling fire while standing in gasoline. Now you might ask, where were the auditors? Where was the oversight? Enter Arthur Andersen, one of the most prestigious accounting firms of the time. Their job was to examine Enron's books and make sure everything was above board. But Andersen was getting paid millions in consulting fees from Enron. So how tough do you think they were willing to be on their golden client? Let's just say their objectivity was flexible. The fox wasn't just guarding the henhouse, it was helping design the door. Meanwhile, Enron's traders were betting on everything: energy prices, bandwidth capacity, even weather patterns. Yes, you heard right. They literally tried to build a market for weather futures, betting on how hot or cold it might get next season. If that sounds insane, it's because it was. The company had become addicted to creating illusionary markets just to justify growth. Real business, actually moving gas and power, was secondary. Paper profits mattered more than real performance. What's truly jaw-dropping is how every layer of the game depended on deception. Management hid losses with SPEs. Accountants blessed the fake deals. Analysts hyped the stock without reading the fine print. And employees kept quiet because their bonuses depended on the illusion. It was a massive echo chamber of denial. Everyone wanted to believe the rocket would keep flying. Everyone forgot that rockets eventually run out of fuel. Inside Enron, the environment became toxic. People who questioned decisions were silenced or sidelined. Whistleblowers were treated as traitors. The internal motto was "Ask why." But ironically, asking why was the fastest way to get yourself fired. Meetings were filled with financial gibberish that impressed outsiders but confused even the insiders. It's like pretending to understand every line of a complicated movie because you don't want to look dumb. Everyone nodded, smiled, and moved on, pretending they got it. By 2000, Enron's stated profits reached mind-blowing levels. But if you looked closer, cash flow from real operations was negative. In simpler terms, they weren't actually making money. They were losing it and disguising the losses with accounting magic. Yet the market rewarded them anyway. The company's executives cashed in stock options to make personal fortunes. Skilling became a multimillionaire. Lay was hailed as a visionary. And Fastow built his empire of shadow finance. It felt unstoppable, like they'd cracked the code of capitalism itself. Let me put it this way. Enron had turned storytelling into a balance sheet. They didn't sell electricity. They sold belief. Every press conference was a performance. Every investor call a show. If you ever wonder how far charisma and confidence can go in business, Enron is Exhibit A. They mastered the art of fake it till you make it, only they never actually made it. The company's real assets were smoke, mirrors, and misplaced trust. and Wall Street lapped it up. Analysts wrote glowing reports calling Enron the Amazon of energy. Banks couldn't get enough of lending them money. Competitors tried to copy their methods, thinking they discovered a new formula for endless growth. It's the same story that repeats each generation. Investors forget basic logic when greed takes the wheel. And when profits look miraculous, nobody wants to read the instructions. Still, deep inside Enron, cracks were forming. Some executives realized that if the share price ever dipped, their entire web of side deals would collapse. They tried to patch holes by creating even more shell companies, hoping to outgrow their problems. But that's like trying to pay one credit card with another. Sooner or later, the bill comes due. Fastow himself began panicking, trying to keep the illusion afloat with increasingly desperate measures. The beast he'd built was eating itself alive. All this might sound abstract: accounting terms, balance sheets, entities. But here's the real takeaway. Enron's fraud wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a business model carefully designed to deceive. It thrived in a climate of deregulation and blind optimism. And for a while, it worked brilliantly until the moment reality started asking for receipts, and there weren't any. You'll see soon that the downfall didn't start with a crash. It started with tiny doubts, whispers, and one brave voice daring to say, "Something here doesn't add up." Before that collapse unfolds, think about what this means for companies today. Transparent business isn't just about rules, it's about culture. When people are rewarded for appearances over results, manipulation becomes inevitable. Enron wasn't merely corrupt, it was logical. Logical in a system where profit mattered more than truth. And that's the scariest lesson here. If the incentives are wrong, even smart people will do stupid things. Their playbook was brilliant, bold, and utterly doomed. The show couldn't go on forever, and soon the curtain would begin to tear, exposing the machinery behind the magic trick once and for all. By the start of 2001, Enron looked invincible. The company had become a global powerhouse. Its stock price had turned ordinary employees into paper millionaires, and the media worshipped its genius executives. From the outside, everything sparkled. But inside those glass towers in Houston, cracks were forming, faint at first, like hairlines on porcelain. At this point, the machine Enron built could only survive if the story stayed flawless. The quarterly reports had to glitter, the projections had to rise, and everyone had to believe. But whispers were starting to spread, rumors that certain numbers didn't make sense, that some projects supposedly generating huge profits didn't actually exist. It was as if you looked behind the curtain of a grand magic show and glimpsed the man pulling the levers. Analysts who once praised Enron began asking uncomfortable questions. They wanted to know exactly how the company made its money. How could a pipeline company suddenly earn billions trading broadband or betting on the weather? Each time someone probed too deeply, the executives responded with a mix of arrogance and hostility. Jeff Skilling, once the golden boy, now looked irritated whenever someone challenged him. In a famous moment during an analyst call, he snapped and insulted a participant who dared to question the numbers. Wall Street laughed it off. The cracks got bigger. By mid-year, even inside Enron's ranks, some employees began to feel uneasy. Departments that once bragged about new deals started to realize there was little actual cash coming in. Some of the assets traded between Enron and its shell companies seemed circular, like money bouncing from one hand to the other. People whispered about the complexity of financial structures that no one could explain. If you're at a job, and every time you ask how the money's made, people say, "Don't worry about it. That's when you should worry." Meanwhile, the auditors from Arthur Andersen kept signing off on the statements, but tensions were rising. They were starting to notice inconsistencies between what was reported and what the book showed. Some at Andersen began sensing the danger. If this facade crumbled, they would be dragged down too. But the fees were too good, and Enron's influence too powerful, so they compromised one more time, then another, until the line between negligence and complicity blurred beyond recognition. The broader market, however, was still high on optimism. The late 90s bubble had just burst, but Enron was marketed as the exception, the safe, new age company not bound by old-fashioned economics. Investors kept pouring money in, desperate to believe that Enron was the future. The press played along, echoing the company's own talking points. The illusion still worked, but you could already see the tremors in the foundation. And then came the first serious warning from within. Sharon Watkins, a mid-level executive and accountant, began noticing accounting irregularities she couldn't explain. The numbers didn't reconcile, the debt was hidden in strange places, and the so-called special entities looked like ticking bombs. She did what few dared. She wrote a memo to the top, directly to Kenneth Lay, warning that the entire thing could collapse in a wave of accounting scandals. Her message was clear. Enron's empire could implode in weeks if anyone looked too closely. Imagine that moment, standing inside a skyscraper built on lies, realizing that one gust of truth could shatter everything. Watkins wasn't trying to expose the company publicly. She was trying to save it. She trusted the leadership would act responsibly. But Lay, ever the politician, tried to downplay the problem. He told others it was just an internal concern, that everything was under control. In reality, it was like smelling smoke and convincing yourself it's just the neighbors grilling. Behind closed doors, executives were panicking. Jeff Skilling abruptly resigned in August 2001, claiming personal reasons. That shocked investors. After all, he was seen as the brain behind Enron's transformation. His sudden departure was the corporate equivalent of the captain leaving the ship mid-voyage. Yet the full reason wasn't personal. He knew the house of cards was trembling and didn't want to be on deck when it collapsed. Kenneth Lay returned as CEO, promising stability. But Lay's calm words couldn't stop what was coming. The press began asking for details about Enron's off-balance sheet entities, those mysterious partnerships hiding billions in debt. The Financial Times and other outlets started digging, publishing investigative pieces filled with numbers that didn't add up. For the first time, major media suggested that Enron's brilliance might be a mirage. Inside the company, morale collapsed. Employees watched their stock options, once their dreams of retirement, start to wobble as Enron's share price slipped. At first it was slight, from $90 down to $70. Then $60. People still hoped it would bounce back. After all, Enron stock had never disappointed before. But beneath those silent prayers, fear began to spread. Because they knew that once Wall Street lost confidence, the magic would die instantly. The press conferences grew intense. Lay stood in front of cameras, repeating that everything was fine, that the fundamentals were strong, that Enron was merely misunderstood. But the more he reassured, the more suspicious people became. Confidence is fragile. When a company starts insisting there's nothing to worry about, investors smell blood. Analysts who once cheered Enron were suddenly re-evaluating their forecasts. The mystique was fading. Arthur Andersen, feeling the heat, started reviewing Enron's records in a frenzy. They debated internally how to handle what they found. And someone made a devastating choice: destruction of documents. Shredders in Andersen's offices ran day and night, turning pages of evidence into confetti. It was a desperate attempt to bury the truth before regulators came knocking. They didn't know it yet, but that decision would destroy the entire firm. By October 2001, Enron's financial statements were impossible to defend. The company admitted to hundreds of millions in losses and restated past earnings. Suddenly, the infallible titan was confessing mistakes. The stock nosedived. Wall Street, once its biggest fan, now smelled decay. Investors rushed for the exits. In just weeks, billions in market value evaporated, taking retirement funds, savings, and dreams with it. Employees watched helplessly as the collapse unfolded. Imagine working your whole career believing you were building something revolutionary, only to discover it was fiction. Some workers had entrusted their entire 401k plans, their retirement savings, entirely in Enron stock. They couldn't sell because the company had frozen trading temporarily, supposedly for administrative reasons. While executives quietly sold their own shares, employees were locked out, watching their wealth vanish in real time. For many, it wasn't just financial ruin, it was betrayal. And here's the cruel irony. Even in the final months, Lay and others kept assuring everyone that recovery was near. Even as the walls cracked, even as investigators circled, they pretended it was all a misunderstanding. They called it a temporary setback, a communication problem, a blip. But by now, the whispers were too loud, the inconsistencies too obvious. You can deny reality for a while, but not forever. In November, the revelations multiplied. Regulators discovered that Enron had hidden more than $1 billion in debt through those shell entities. The supposed profits were just creative bookkeeping. It was not innovation, it was fraud. Markets panicked. Credit agencies downgraded Enron's ratings to junk, and partners began pulling out of deals. The dominoes started falling faster than anyone could stop them. As the ship went down, Jeff Skilling tried to distance himself. Lay stayed publicly calm, and Andy Fastow, the architect of the shadow entities, became the perfect scapegoat. But the truth was that everyone at the top had known, to some extent. The line between ignorance and complicity was blurry, drawn in pencil by people who wanted to believe their own story. It wasn't that they didn't see the problem, it was that they couldn't afford to admit it. Enron's decline wasn't an explosion, it was a slow suffocation. Trust vanished first, then liquidity, then the illusion of control. Banks refused to lend, partners cut ties. Within weeks, the titan of innovation was begging for cash to stay alive. For a company once valued higher than some nations, it was a humiliating endgame. And yet, no one could claim surprise anymore. The whispers had turned into a storm. By early December 2001, Enron filed for bankruptcy, the largest in history at the time. Thousands of employees were jobless. Pension funds evaporated. Investors faced catastrophic losses. And the entire financial world stood in shock, wondering how no one had seen this coming. The truth was, many had seen it. They just chose not to look, because the lie had been too profitable, too exciting, too convenient. Looking back, the tragedy wasn't only in the billions lost, but in the faith destroyed. Faith in markets, in innovation, in corporate leadership. Enron didn't just bankrupt a company, it bankrupted trust, and that's far harder to rebuild. Before we move into the full collapse and its aftermath, remember this: every great disaster begins with whispers. Whispers ignored, red flags dismissed, warnings downplayed. And when deceit finally meets daylight, it burns everything in its path. The whisper became a roar, and the roar would soon bring Enron and Andersen crashing down together. By the end of 2001, Enron had transformed from Wall Street's golden child into the symbol of greed and deception. It happened fast, too fast for most people to process. Just months before, analysts were calling it the future of business. Now, headlines screamed collapse, scandal, and betrayal. The company that claimed to redefine capitalism had imploded under the weight of its own lies. Let's rewind for a moment. When Enron admitted it had overstated earnings by hundreds of millions and hidden billions in debt, the illusion shattered instantly. The stock price, once over $90, free fell toward the ground. Each day brought new revelations, more confusion, and new panic. Investors couldn't get out fast enough. To watch Enron's stock chart in those weeks was like watching a ski slope, steep, cold, and deadly. Inside Houston's skyscraper headquarters, chaos reigned. Employees who once strutted around as mini-moguls now stood stunned, watching their lives unravel. Many had their entire retirement savings tied up in company stock, savings that vanished almost overnight. Payrolls froze. Projects stopped. People who had believed in the company's genius realized they had been working inside a bubble of fiction. For outsiders, Enron's fall was incomprehensible. How could a company this big, this powerful, collapse so completely, so suddenly? Regulators scrambled to figure out what went wrong. Politicians rushed to distance themselves from executives they had once praised. Journalists who'd celebrated Enron's innovation now wrote about its deceit. It wasn't just the financial loss. It was the betrayal of trust that struck a chord across America. Within days of filing bankruptcy, Enron became the largest corporate failure in history at that time. 30,000 employees lost their jobs. Pension funds tied to Enron's shares were destroyed. Communities that depended on the company's presence were left hollow. It felt like the American dream had just driven off a cliff, and everyone was still holding onto the steering wheel, wondering what happened. The personal stories that came out were heartbreaking. Imagine spending 20 years at a company, watching your savings and retirement grow, only to see it all gone in a matter of weeks. For many, the devastation wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Their trust in the system collapsed with the company. Some employees said they felt foolish for believing the hype. Others were simply angry that executives had cashed out while they were told to hold their shares. Meanwhile, the executives at the top scrambled for safety. Kenneth Lay insisted he was as shocked as everyone else, claiming he never knew about the extent of the wrongdoing. Jeff Skilling kept a low profile, avoiding the public eye, while Andy Fastow became the central target, the bad guy accused of engineering the web of deceit. But the reality was more complex. Enron's fall wasn't the fault of one man. It was the logical result of a culture driven by greed, arrogance, and denial. In Washington, Congress wasted no time. Committees were formed, subpoenas issued, and hearings scheduled. The spectacle was televised, executives sitting under bright lights, faces pale, voices tense. Lawmakers demanded answers. Who approved these deals? Who signed off on the books? How could everyone have missed it? Those hearings became must-watch television, a mix of drama, outrage, and disbelief. The testimony was almost surreal. Some former executives blamed accounting errors, others claimed ignorance. Kenneth Lay played the part of the bewildered patriarch, suggesting he was betrayed by those around him. Jeff Skilling, when he spoke, sounded defensive and robotic, insisting there was no fraud. The more they talked, the less believable they became. The carefully curated image of visionary leadership dissolved into confusion and denial. And then there was Arthur Andersen. Once a titan among auditors, Andersen now faced its own reckoning. Investigators discovered the firm had shredded thousands of Enron documents just as the scandal broke. It looked undeniably like a cover-up. Within months, Andersen itself collapsed. One of the most respected accounting firms in the world, gone. The partnership that once symbolized transparency now stood as proof that oversight can fail when profit blinds integrity. Outside the courtroom, public anger boiled. Ordinary Americans who had no stake in Enron felt the sting of injustice. They looked at executives who pocketed millions while workers lost everything. The phrase corporate greed became a national talking point. Late-night shows joked about it. Economists dissected it. Educators taught it as a new moral case study. Enron had become a byword for deceit, much like Watergate was for corruption. What made the fall even more shocking was how preventable it all was. Dozens of people along the chain of command could have spoken up earlier. Regulators could have dug deeper. Auditors could have questioned the bizarre financial statements. But everyone had a reason to look the other way: money, reputation, or simply fear. When you build a system where success is rewarded and honesty is punished, collapse isn't a matter of if, but when. The collapse also exposed a cruel imbalance. While the top escaped with golden parachutes, ordinary workers got nothing. Lay and Skilling had sold shares worth millions before the fall, ensuring their wealth was secure. Employees, on the other hand, were forbidden from selling during the meltdown, trapped by corporate policy. It was a robbery dressed in a business suit, where legality blurred into indecency. The outrage it sparked would fuel reforms for years. As the investigations deepened, every secret Enron kept began spilling into daylight. The shell companies, the fake profits, the political donations, everything connected. What emerged was not simply an accounting failure, but a moral one. The rot went far beyond spreadsheets. It infected corporate culture itself. Enron didn't just manipulate numbers, it manipulated people's faith in modern capitalism. The emotional toll was immense. Former employees held vigils outside headquarters, holding signs and photos of their lost savings. Some wept, others shouted. The city of Houston, once proud of Enron's glittering skyline symbol, now viewed the logo as a wound. It served as a reminder of what blind ambition can destroy. For those inside the system, it was a wake-up call. For those outside, a cautionary tale. In the aftermath, legal battles consumed the next few years. Andy Fastow faced charges and pled guilty to fraud. Kenneth Lay and Jeff Skilling both stood trial. The courtroom scenes looked like something out of a movie. Lawyers in sharp suits, witnesses trembling, and exhibits showing Enron's phantom deals. The evidence was overwhelming. Emails, memos, contracts, all proving that deception wasn't an accident. It was policy. The sentences that followed sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Fastow went to prison. Lay was convicted but died before sentencing. Skilling got more than 20 years behind bars, later reduced on appeal. It was the first time many Americans saw powerful executives actually face consequences for corporate crime. But while justice was served on paper, the damage done to thousands of innocent people could never truly be undone. Even after the trials ended, the ripples kept spreading. Companies across the country began auditing themselves, terrified of becoming the next Enron. Investors demanded transparency, and regulators strengthened disclosure requirements. The Securities and Exchange Commission faced scrutiny for its failures. Out of Enron's ashes, a new era of corporate oversight was about to rise, one born not from progress, but from catastrophe. And yet, for all the reforms, something deeper changed in the American psyche. The idea that corporations could be trusted to police themselves was shattered. Confidence in business leadership, once a cornerstone of the American dream, was replaced with suspicion. When people looked at CEOs now, they didn't see innovators. They saw potential liars. Enron had poisoned the well of trust. You might wonder if this was the end of the story. The bad guys caught, the system fixed. But no, it wasn't that simple. The financial system would reinvent itself again and again, finding new ways to push the limits of ethics in pursuit of profit. Enron was a warning, yet history tends to forget warnings when money is on the line. The cycle of greed doesn't stop. It just changes form. By the time Enron's logo was taken down from its former headquarters, it was more than just the end of a company. It was the burial of an era, the end of unchecked corporate myth-making. The brightest minds of their generation had built a monster, then acted surprised when it devoured them. The story had gone full circle, from triumph to tragedy. The company that once promised unlimited energy had burned itself out completely. And as the lights dimmed on Enron's story, one truth remained. Power built on lies always collapses under its own weight. The fall of Enron wasn't just a financial event, it was a moral earthquake that exposed the weaknesses of an entire system. What came next would reshape the rules of business forever. But the cost was measured in lost livelihoods, shaken faith, and a scar that still lingers in the soul of modern capitalism. If Enron was a masterpiece of deception, then Arthur Andersen was its silent accomplice, the partner that made the illusion possible. Auditors are supposed to be the gatekeepers, the referees making sure the books tell the truth. But in this case, the referee decided to play for the home team. The collapse of Andersen is one of the most shocking parts of the Enron story, because it shows what happens when ethics become negotiable. Let's rewind to understand how this relationship became so toxic. Arthur Andersen was one of the so-called Big Five accounting firms, alongside giants like Deloitte and PricewaterhouseCoopers. It was a company built on reputation, once famous for its integrity. Its motto, "Think straight, talk straight," symbolized the very essence of trust in financial reporting. CEOs and investors believed that a stamp of approval from Andersen meant reliability. And then came Enron. In the 1990s, Enron became one of Andersen's largest clients, bringing in tens of millions in fees every year. That's where the trouble began. The auditors weren't just checking Enron's books. They were making money from consulting work too, designing internal systems, advising on tax structures, even helping craft the same financial entities they were supposed to review. That's like hiring the same person to build your house and inspect it for safety. Conflict of interest doesn't even begin to describe it. Every year, Enron's profits grew on paper, and Andersen kept signing off. Their teams were based right inside Enron's offices, literally working side by side. The relationship was cozy, almost intimate. Andersen's auditors went from watchdogs to cheerleaders. And as long as Enron kept paying, no one at Andersen wanted to ask awkward questions. The beautiful illusion of profits was too profitable for both sides to ruin. When Enron started using those complex special-purpose entities, the shell companies hiding debt, Andersen saw them. They were fully aware that the transactions looked suspicious, but every time someone at Andersen's lower levels raised an eyebrow, higher management overruled them. The logic was simple. Enron was one of their biggest accounts, and no one wanted to lose it. In business, silence can be very lucrative. Inside Andersen, there was growing tension. Some auditors genuinely worried that Enron's accounting didn't add up, but the leadership prioritized revenue over responsibility. In meetings, partners debated how much independence an auditor could truly have when auditing a client that represented a huge chunk of annual profits. Some even joked that their job wasn't to challenge Enron, but to justify its ambitions. When integrity clashes with incentives, incentives tend to win. Then the crisis hit. When investigators began probing Enron's financial statements in late 2001, Andersen found itself in the spotlight. Suddenly, their close relationship with Enron looked less like partnership and more like conspiracy. The world wanted to know, how could these professionals not have noticed billions in hidden debt? The uncomfortable truth was that they did notice, but chose to rationalize it away. In October 2001, an Andersen lawyer sent a memo that would become infamous. It urged employees to destroy documents related to Enron, following Andersen's document retention policy. Sounds bureaucratic, right? In reality, it was a frantic effort to erase evidence. Shredders started running overtime in Andersen offices, reducing emails, memos, and draft documents to confetti. It was a scene straight out of a political thriller, except this wasn't fiction. When investigators learned about the document destruction, the damage was irreversible. The act screamed guilt, even if the intent could be debated. Imagine finding someone burning papers in their backyard just as you start asking questions about their business. It doesn't look good. Federal prosecutors moved fast. They accused Andersen of obstruction of justice, and the once prestigious firm was suddenly fighting for its life. During the trial, Andersen's defense argued that the shredding was a misunderstanding, that employees followed a standard internal policy, not a cover-up. But the optics were dreadful. The public saw it as an attempt to wipe the past clean, to erase accountability before the truth surfaced. When the verdict came, Andersen was found guilty. Though that conviction would later be overturned, the damage to its reputation was fatal. Clients fled overnight. Within months, Arthur Andersen was gone, a century-old titan annihilated by its own greed and cowardice. The Andersen saga wasn't just about one firm's failure. It exposed a system where auditors, instead of serving as independent guardians, had become business partners with their clients. The financial world realized it had a trust problem. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions about all the other companies being audited by the Big Five. How many more Enrons were out there, hidden behind clean audits and glowing reports? It shook the foundations of confidence that Wall Street depended on. Inside Andersen's ruined reputation lies a crucial lesson about proximity and power. The closer auditors get to the companies they're meant to monitor, the harder it becomes to say no. When friendships blur into business, independence evaporates. Everyone at Andersen believed they could manage the conflict, that as long as they kept the balance sheet looking good, consequences would never arrive. But accountability delayed is accountability denied, and eventually, reality catches up. This scandal forced regulators to rethink auditing altogether. Policymakers realized that if auditors could be bought, indirectly or otherwise, then financial transparency was just another illusion. It was like discovering that the security guard at the bank had been accepting bribes from robbers to look the other way. The outrage built momentum for a new wave of reforms that would soon become law. The Enron-Andersen relationship also highlighted something deeper: the fragility of reputation. For decades, Andersen had cultivated an image of moral superiority, but in a few months, that image was gone forever. It revealed that no matter how prestigious a brand may be, ethics are not permanent. They must be practiced daily. Reputation isn't bulletproof. It's glass, shiny and fragile, and when it breaks, it cuts deeply. Some Andersen employees paid the price without ever benefiting from the fraud. Thousands lost their jobs when the firm collapsed. Decent people whose only mistake was working for a company that chose loyalty to profit over loyalty to truth. Imagine dedicating years to your profession, only to watch your career vanish in scandal because those above you couldn't say stop. It's a bitter irony. The ones who followed the rules often suffer the most when leaders ignore them. The connection between Enron and Andersen became a symbol of everything wrong with corporate America at the time. It wasn't just bad accounting practices. It was a mindset that profits mattered more than ethics, results more than honesty. Both institutions fed off each other's ambition. Enron wanted validation, Andersen wanted money, and together they built a lie so perfect that even they started believing it. That's how hubris blinds even the smartest in the room. When the dust settled, the government realized this wasn't an isolated crisis. It was a systemic one. The solution came in the form of harsher laws and tougher oversight, aimed at preventing another Enron-Andersen disaster. But even so, many insiders knew that regulation could only go so far. True prevention begins with culture, with individuals deciding that truth still matters even when it's inconvenient. Let's pause a moment and think about the moral of this story. Auditors are supposed to be the last defense between the public and financial chaos. They are there to ensure accountability, to keep capitalism honest. But once they see themselves as partners in profit instead of guardians of truth, they become part of the problem. Andersen crossed that line long before Enron imploded. By the time they realized it, there was no line left to cross. You might assume that after such a shocking scandal, the lessons were instantly learned. They weren't. Over the following years, other companies would flirt with similar dangers, manipulating numbers, hiding losses, pushing the limits of what was legal. Andersen's ghost lingered in boardrooms as both warning and temptation. After all, the temptation to make numbers look better than they are never fully disappears. It simply evolves with new tricks and new terminology. Still, Andersen's fall left a permanent scar on the accounting profession. Universities began teaching the Enron-Andersen saga as a parable of ethics gone wrong. Regulators introduced new requirements demanding stricter separation between auditing and consulting. The message was clear: independence must not only exist, but be seen to exist. Because once the public stops believing in auditors, the entire economic system starts to wobble. In the broader scheme of things, Andersen's demise marked the symbolic death of moral complacency in corporate America. It forced the industry to confront an uncomfortable truth: that even the most trusted institutions can rot from the inside if integrity isn't protected. Accountability could no longer be an option. It had to be a baseline. Enron may have died in bankruptcy court, but Andersen's death delivered the louder warning shot. By the time both companies collapsed, the word audit had lost its power to reassure. People no longer trusted numbers simply because they were signed by professionals. Leaders, investors, and employees alike understood something profound. Financial systems survive not because they're perfect, but because people inside them choose every day not to cheat. The moment that commitment fades, everything else falls apart. So next time you hear about financial transparency or corporate ethics, remember this chapter of the story. The watchdogs stopped barking because they were feeding on the same meat as the thieves. Arthur Andersen's legacy isn't just one of failure. It's a cautionary tale that ethics can't coexist with greed. And while Enron's collapse may have been spectacular, Andersen's quiet self-destruction was the most tragic proof that when auditors look the other way, everyone pays the price. After the dust settled and the headlines began to fade, America was left asking one question: how could this happen again? The Enron collapse wasn't just a financial scandal. It was an existential crisis for capitalism itself. It forced a reckoning, not only within Wall Street, but across boardrooms everywhere. When a company as respected, innovative, and admired as Enron could turn into a symbol of fraud, suddenly every success story seemed suspect. In the months following Enron's bankruptcy, trust evaporated from the market. Investors became cautious, analysts skeptical, and regulators panicked. For the first time in decades, ordinary people realized that even audited numbers could lie. The myth of corporate transparency had been shattered. And if that truth scared CEOs, it terrified politicians, because the public was demanding not just explanations, but reform. Congress moved quickly, holding round-the-clock hearings filled with finger-pointing and moral outrage. Lawmakers wanted to show they meant business. The result was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, named after the legislators who drafted it. This law became the most sweeping corporate reform in a generation. It aimed to make companies more accountable, more transparent, and most importantly, less able to pretend that profit existed when it didn't. So what did Sarbanes-Oxley actually do? In simple terms, it forced CEOs and CFOs, the top brass, to personally certify their company's financial statements. No more hiding behind layers of accountants. If a report was false, the executives themselves could face criminal charges. It also created the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, a watchdog meant to keep auditors honest. And it demanded that companies strengthen internal controls, so financial manipulation would be harder to hide. Sounds good, right? And it was, at least on paper. But laws can only do so much. The deeper lesson wasn't about paperwork or procedures. It was about culture. Enron proved that clever regulation can't stop people determined to cheat. Real change happens only when integrity becomes more valuable than short-term gain. In that sense, Sarbanes-Oxley was both a remedy and a warning, proof that every system needs constant vigilance to survive. The ripple effects went far beyond law firms and boardrooms. Universities redesigned their business ethics courses. Students who once dreamed of becoming corporate executives began asking hard questions about moral responsibility. Business schools now teach Enron as a case study not in innovation, but in hubris. That's quite a legacy for a company that once called itself the future of energy. Meanwhile, auditing firms rebuilt their practices under the new oversight rules. No longer could they mix consulting contracts with auditing work on the same client. The idea was simple. If you're supposed to check the books, you shouldn't also be designing them. It was a forced divorce between profit and integrity. For a while, it brought back confidence in financial statements, but skepticism never fully disappeared. Once burned, investors tend to keep their distance. The people hit hardest by the scandal, employees and retirees, bore scars that lasted decades. Thousands lost their jobs, their savings, and their faith in corporate America. Some never recovered financially. For them, Enron wasn't a cautionary tale. It was a personal tragedy. Imagine working 20 years for a company, only to learn your pension has vanished into accounting smoke. It's no wonder that generations since have grown wary of putting blind faith in their employers. Politically, Enron also reshaped the landscape of corporate regulation. It exposed how deeply business and politics were intertwined, and how dangerous that relationship could be. Enron's extensive lobbying network, once a source of power, became evidence of corruption. Overnight, the company's ties to Washington turned toxic. No politician wanted to be linked to the scandal that had rocked the foundation of the American economy. Globally, the story served as a warning to other countries embracing deregulation and privatization. Governments realized that allowing markets to operate without oversight could create monsters. Enron's fall became the textbook case of what happens when ambition outpaces accountability. It reminded the world that capitalism's strength lies not just in competition, but in trust. And when that trust breaks, everyone loses. Ironically, the scandal also had a strange side effect. It created a new industry: corporate compliance. Companies began hiring chief ethics officers, building entire departments dedicated to enforcing good behavior. Training videos, transparency pledges, and whistleblower hotlines became the norm. In a way, Enron turned ethics into a business model of its own, one built on preventing the next Enron. But let's be real. Did these efforts truly fix the system? Maybe not entirely. Energy trading evolved. Wall Street moved on, and new financial crises appeared in different clothes. A few years later, the world faced the 2008 financial meltdown, proof that the same temptations resurface when greed finds a loophole. The difference was that this time, people remembered Enron. They knew what unchecked ambition could destroy. Still, Enron's legacy lives on as both caution and catalyst. The Sarbanes-Oxley reforms made it harder for executives to deceive investors so easily. Auditing standards improved, and the media learned to dig deeper. Yet, beneath the progress, the same human elements remain: greed, pride, and the craving for power. You can regulate markets, but you can't outlaw ego. And that's the truth most people prefer not to admit. The cultural impact of the scandal runs deep. Movies, documentaries, books, and plays have dissected every angle of Enron's rise and fall. The story resonates because it's not just about numbers, it's about human. How far will people go to defend an illusion? What happens when success becomes more important than truth? Enron answered those questions with devastating clarity, and the answers still haunt boardrooms today. Even technology companies now reference the scandal as a reminder of what happens when innovation outruns ethics. In the age of AI and crypto, parallels to Enron pop up often. Hype, Inflated valuations, blind faith in genius, the names change, but the psychology remains identical. The public falls in love with the next big thing, while behind the curtain, questionable practices brew. That rhythm, that human pattern, is what makes Enron's legacy feel eternal. There's also a broader societal lesson hidden in all of this. We often celebrate success stories without questioning their foundations. Enron showed that charisma, marketing, and aggressive storytelling can fool even the smartest minds. It taught us to look beyond the quarterly reports and glossy presentations, to ask the uncomfortable questions. How is this really making money should always be on the table. For corporations, the takeaway is brutally simple. Integrity is not optional. In the short run, deceit might look like clever strategy, but over time, it corrodes everything: culture, trust, and reputation. Leaders who forget that end up building empires on sand. The higher they climb, the harder they fall. Kenneth Lay, Jeff Skilling, Andy Fastow, they all learned that the hard way. And for the rest of us, investors, employees, citizens, Enron left a permanent reminder. Blind optimism is dangerous. Trust must be earned, not assumed. If something looks too good to be true, it probably is. Those lessons might sound obvious, but they are lessons every generation has to relearn when greed dresses itself in new clothes. At the end of the day, Enron's legacy isn't just about fraud. It's about how humans interact with systems built on trust. Markets function because people believe in fairness, in accountability, in rules that apply equally. When that belief breaks, value evaporates faster than numbers on a screen. The Enron saga proved that ethics aren't a cost. They're an investment in stability. Lose them, and the price will always come due. So if you ever think of Enron as just an old scandal from the past, remember this: its fingerprints are still everywhere. In every compliance meeting, in every signature on a financial report, in every mention of internal controls, there's a trace of Enron. The company may be long gone, but its shadow remains. It's the ghost that whispers a quiet warning to every ambitious CIO. That cleverness without conscience isn't brilliance, it's a ticking bomb. Because trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. And that may be the most expensive lesson Enron ever taught. In the end, it didn't just destroy a company. It forced the world to see the cracks in its own reflection. And for a moment, just long enough, that reflection forced people to ask the question they should have been asking all along. What is success worth if it's built on a lie?